Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute podcast. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this episode, our guest is Ned Desmond, COO of TechCrunch, an online media site that focuses on startup news, covering everything from new companies, new gadgets, and social media here in the US and in Europe and Asia. Before becoming COO of TechCrunch, Ned founded several media companies, including eCompany Now, and was head of digital at Time Inc. Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, sat down with Ned Desmond when he was our guest speaker at PRI's Young Leaders Circle reception at the Maritime Wine Bar in San Francisco. They talked about the state of the media business, traditional versus new media, consolidation versus decentralization, and of course, fake news. I think you'll enjoy it. Thanks for listening.
Well, Ned Desmond, welcome to PRI's podcast. We're really pleased to have you here today. You're the COO of TechCrunch, which is an online publication that covers the latest developments in the tech world. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with your site, talk about TechCrunch and what our listeners can find when they visit there.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be here with you and with PRI. So TechCrunch is a publication that got started about 10 years ago because startups were becoming an increasingly big story, but nobody was really covering it very well. And the founder, Mike Arrington, had that big insight that startups were a subject of news in and of themselves. So today, what TechCrunch does is cover what we hope is everything that's important in the startup world, from product releases to big fundings of new companies to big fundraisers by big venture capital outfits. And we like to think that people read about it first on TechCrunch. That's really what we're all about. We also have a very big event business, which is how we're face-to-face and in close quarters with all these people that we cover. And that spans the entire world, from Asia to Europe to the United States. There are about 10 million people in the United States alone who now read TechCrunch on a monthly basis.
It's probably not a surprise to say that the news business has really rapidly evolved over the past 2 decades. And you've had a front row seat to a lot of this change. I know I read a statistic the other day that here in California, the Mercury News, one of the great newspapers of our state, back in their heyday in the 90s, they had 400 reporters in the newsroom. And today I think it's something like 35 reporters. So we're really seeing a shift from these kind of traditional newspapers and magazines shutting down or transforming their role to being more online publications. I know all my reporter friends for like the LA Times they're like spinning plates, having to write for the print edition, get things for online and such. You're even seeing television is playing much less of a role in people's kind of news and information gathering. So in your view, what do you think of this? Is the decline of kind of the traditional media source a good thing or a bad thing?
I guess I would put it this way, Tim. I think the decline of really good journalism is a bad thing. There's just less of it anywhere you look, whether you're thinking about foreign correspondents working for big American media overseas, they barely exist any longer, or whether you're thinking about reporters covering the local metros and local news, they've been greatly diminished as well. So no, it hasn't been particularly good, I think, for the country or for journalism. The result, which I think we can all agree on, is much less news. The cause, of course, is a more complicated question.
So as these kind of traditional media companies struggle to survive, we're seeing newsroom budgets slashed. We saw just the other day the digital media folks, the Orange County Register and all them, fired a lot of their photographers on the street. And they're going to have another couple of rounds of layoffs. You're seeing long-term reporters retiring. We just saw Jim Boren, the long-term editor of the Fresno Bee, retire. And others like Dan Walters are retiring from the Sacramento Bee and going to online publications. We've seen it in Sacramento, bureaus closing and not as many people covering capitals and government. So as a result, you're seeing critical stories go and beats go underreported. So how can online media sources like TechCrunch fill this critical void?
TechCrunch probably didn't fill a void that existed, really, because it really went after a new category, which is this startup news category. But generally speaking, I think what's happened in the newspaper business in the United States is that it was once upon a time a very wealthy, prosperous business. And as a result, it was embedded with a lot of costs, long-standing costs associated with producing print publications, running big sales teams, having lots of things that were just taken for granted, legacy costs. And then this new medium comes along with very low costs, namely the internet, and it upends not only behavior of consumers, but really upends those businesses that were once so dominant in print, and print disappeared years, those cost structures become unbearable because the revenue isn't there to support them. And further, and this is one of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight at this PRI event, many legacy publishers in the mainstream media made some pretty bad business and product decisions that only made this really tough situation even worse.
So, getting out your crystal ball, how do you see the media world continuing to change in the coming years? What role do you see outlets like TechCrunch playing as we increasingly get our news from online sources? Do you think there will still be a role for print and radio and TV 25 or 50 years down the road?
That's a really big question, Tim. So I would say all of those things will continue to exist, but the proportion in which they exist relative to each other is going to change pretty dramatically. So print will, of course, continue to fade out as it has, except in the case perhaps of specialty publications where the form itself, say a really beautiful magazine, may always be valuable and worth paying for to a small audience. I think radio is not going to go anywhere. Radio is a very popular medium. It'll just change. It'll be something that you can enjoy in a lot of formats. TV, of course, is changing radically and already has changed because of the death of linear TV, more or less, with the exception of football games, which we all need to watch in real time, of course, and of NBA and all the rest. But I think that the one of the most important developments right now, in not in print specifically, but in the mainstream media world of journalism, is that the people who are running those businesses today, and it's maybe the third or fourth generation of people running those businesses, because there's been so much turnover in the past 20 years as these mainstream media outlets struggled to figure out what to do with their business as things just collapsed around them. Some of those properties now, for instance, the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal for quite some time, have recovered their belief in the idea that readers should pay for what they produce. So this was jettisoned. The idea that readers should pay, this idea was jettisoned really back in the mid-2000s. And it was quite a heated conversation in those days. Big titles like the New York Times really bought into Google's point of view, which was that all content should be free and ad-supported. And this really played, I think, into the natural vanities of publishers and journalists everywhere. If I can get 100 million people to read my story, why wouldn't I want to do that? And thank you, Google, very much for making that possible. But unfortunately, there was a price that wasn't very apparent at the time, and that was that readers would no longer be contributing revenue to these businesses as they always had in buying subscriptions. And secondly, that the advertising side of the house was going to experience a very steep decline because as audiences grew and cheap competitors to the New York Times arose, then the ability of the New York Times, for instance, I'm just using them as one example, but the lesson I think applies broadly across the board, could not really command great pricing against advertising associated with its brand online. And what we're seeing now is big titles like the New York Times and others, as I mentioned, are really recovering that idea that we produce a very fine quality product and we should be willing to charge people for it and people should be willing to pay for it. And today, I believe 1.6 million digital subscribers exist for the New York Times, which is astonishing considering that 10 years ago, the New York Times absolutely ruled this out and wouldn't even countenance this business line. So that, I think, is the big change. The confidence is returning to big publishers that they can charge readers for quality work.
So many are concerned with media outlets being consolidated in the hands of a few powerful companies and those companies kind of swaying the news coverage. Yet online and social media provide really a great opportunity to get exposure for diverse viewpoints and stories that don't necessarily receive mainstream coverage. So as we see media increasingly move online, do you think this consolidation trend will continue, or do you think we'll see more of a decentralization trend of media ownership and voices?
Well, I think that the consolidation trend among established old world media firms is likely to continue, especially under the Trump administration, which doesn't seem too concerned about consolidation of media ownership. That said, I don't think that the internet is subject to that at all. So there are many competing sources of news and information. Problem is how much of that news is any good and how systematic is it? Can you really rely on Nextdoor and a few blogs to understand what's happening in your city as opposed to really quality qualified, committed journalists who are on the beat all day in and day out, really reporting the story. So it's really not a great substitute in my mind. But also, part of the question you asked is how long will this continue? How much more consolidation will there be? It's really interesting because right now you might say that as private equity and other kinds of money comes in and buys up these ailing properties, right now they're only buying into a wish and a dream that these businesses can be turned around and salvaged one way or another. And of course, a lot of them are very valuable brands and they play an incredibly important part in the news ecosystem and in their communities. So one has to hope that one way or another they'll eventually get salvaged and that the guys who dropped the money in there will be rewarded for their efforts. And that's what I hope eventually happens here. Even if there's a fair amount of consolidation, at least the risk capital is flowing in to try to wait out the effort to figure out how to turn around these businesses so they can be a part of the community that they once were.
One area that TechCrunch has covered is this so-called fake news epidemic, and it seems to be the topic du jour these days. We had the president's Fake News Awards a couple of weeks ago, and it really seems like your opinion of what's fake news and what isn't kind of depends on where one stands politically on things. Partisanship aside, how big of a problem do you think fake news is in the online world? Should people be concerned about this?
I'm not a big fan of the fake news term, you might say. There is no question that people can manipulate news and that there are forces in play who are actively doing that, whether it's, you could call it relatively benign in the instance of the way politicians and political parties behave, or you could call it actively malevolent, say if the Russians or the Chinese or somebody are in there working banks of anonymous social media contributors to try to influence or inflame tensions around things. I mean, we've certainly seen in many countries, and the United States is no exception, that the right story placed at the right time going viral can have an enormous impact and even wind up creating a lot of violence and loss of life, and can be completely wrong because somehow it plays into the prejudices that cause it to go viral and explosive. And by the time the damage is done, it's too late for somebody to set the record straight. So this type of activity exists, and it's very dangerous, and there are people out there who actively manipulate that. That is the edge case in a lot of respects, and I think the bigger danger is that the way Facebook and Google have not really differentiated in any effective way, although now Mark Zuckerberg, of course, is promising to try to figure this out, between what you might call copycat information or just generally scurrilous information versus the work of people who may have their biases, but have a much higher professional aspirations and quality in their work. For years I've always been amused at how Google, which has somewhat fixed this situation now, but for years really didn't make any distinction, say, between a really great story from, say, People magazine, which might break important celebrity news, and any of a dozen blogs that were basically ripping off the People magazine exclusive breaking story, which would have been very credibly sourced and highly reliable. Well, why was that? Why did Google not know the difference? It's because those blogs were written, published on systems that had a much better capacity to interact with Google's search algorithms than, say, People's old-fashioned content management system, which was not optimized for that. So should that technological difference have been the basis of who got on top and who didn't? To my mind, as a publishing guy, that was crazy. Of course the people piece should come out on top, but that's not how Google and its engineers saw the world or the way they built their algorithm. So that dynamic has had an enormous impact.
Staying on that point, we've all heard about Facebook's recent announcement that they're going to take some steps on the news that you choose to better educate people, if you will. Do you think Google or Facebook or Twitter, do they have a responsibility to step in and do something? Because there's really kind of a balance between a big brother tech giant coloring what may be a very legitimate viewpoint as biased news or news that goes further down the algorithm. It kind of evokes censorship fears in my mind, even though there are very harmful and legitimate reasons why a Facebook or a Twitter needs to take action to protect their readership, really.
That's a great question. I think it's easy when you're sitting in Silicon Valley to imagine that Google and Facebook just built fabulous platforms. They each did it. They're so successful. Everybody uses them, and they're miracles, really, of the digital age. And since there's no active effort on their part to encourage sketchy news or to deepen nasty prejudices that people have on one topic or another, that they really can't be blamed if that's a byproduct of their platform. But I think it's clearly, in my mind, morally incumbent on these businesses to understand the impact of what they've built. And I don't think they can walk away from the moral responsibility for that. They may say, we don't know how to judge, or who are we to judge? But there are, in fact, many ways. There have been many proposals about how they could, I'll use the word filter, but I don't really mean it in a technical sense, filter what's visible on the platform and treat it more responsibly. You can't have the impact on society that Facebook and Google have and then pretend like you're not responsible for that.
So in my mind, there's a difference between news content and then the continuing brouhaha that we had from the 2016 election and all the Russian bots promulgating all of these stories. So do you think there's a different responsibility or a different response that these companies need to have with regards to what happened in the 2016 election versus untoward stories on Paris Hilton, filtering up, or, some sports star or something like that?
Yes, and I think there has to be some accountability here. There is a sensibility problem, I think, sometimes in Silicon Valley, where it's possible for an executive to shrug off the challenge coming out of Washington that your system may have disrupted a democratic outcome in the United States. No one will ever be able to prove that it did. It's possible that it did. It was a close election. There were many, many factors. But nonetheless, it's something that eventually gave Mr. Zuckerberg pause because he's now doing something about it. But initially, he shrugged it off and said, what's the big deal? I guess that's understandable, but I don't think it's commendable and it shouldn't stand. Because at the end of the day, the smooth conduct of democracy in the United States is the most important thing that we have. And no platform should be in a position to interrupt that.
All of this talk is a little depressing. So we always like to end these podcasts, and especially since we're recording this in a wine bar. We love nothing more at PRI, and especially on our podcast, to talk about wine, especially here in the shadow of wine country and all the great wine regions that we have in our state. So we always ask our guests for the last question to recommend either their favorite wine that they recommend our listeners try, or other adult beverage that you recommend they try.
Well, I'm very fond of the Amici Cabernet. It's very nice and I'm also very fond of the Pinot Noirs from Willamette Valley in Oregon. So hard to keep me away from any good wine, but those are two that are top of mind for me. And thank you for asking.
Well, on that note, let's go have a glass of wine, and we'll say thank you very much, Ned Desmond, for joining us on the PRI podcast.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thanks again to our guests, Ned Desmond, and to Tim Anaya. To learn more about TechCrunch, go to the website at techcrunch.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Also, check out our blog, Right by the Bay, on our website at pacificresearch.org. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for another episode of PRI's podcast.